Welcome to Red Moonlight Stories. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The mountain rose before them like a cathedral of ice, its jagged spires piercing the sky with an authority that silenced even the most confident climbers. For Clara, the wife, it was not just a climb but a pilgrimage, a chance to prove resilience, to share adventure with her husband Daniel, and to trust in the companionship of his longtime friend, Marcus. The three of them stood at the base, their packs heavy, their spirits buoyed by the crisp air that promised both danger and exhilaration. At first, there was camaraderie. Daniel cracked jokes about the absurd weight of their gear, Marcus teased Clara about her meticulous notes on survival techniques, and Clara herself laughed, though her laughter carried a nervous edge. She had read enough accounts of wild expeditions to know that the mountain was not merely a backdrop but a force that tested bonds, sometimes breaking them in ways more brutal than avalanches or frostbite. She had dismissed those accounts as rare, extreme, the kind of cautionary tales that circulated in mountaineering forums. Yet as she tightened the straps on her pack, she could not shake the unease that those stories might one day echo in her own life. The ascent began with rhythm. Boots crunched against snow, ice axes bit into frozen walls, and ropes tethered them together in a fragile chain of trust. Clara marveled at the silence of the Alpine world, broken only by the wind's howl and the occasional call between climbers. Daniel led with confidence, Marcus followed with practiced ease, and Clara, though slower, kept pace. She wanted to believe in the strength of their trio, in the bond that had carried them through years of friendship and marriage. But even in those early hours, subtle fissures appeared. Daniel's glances toward Marcus lingered too long, filled with a warmth that seemed misplaced in the cold. Marcus, in turn, often walked beside Daniel, leaving Clara to trail behind. When Clara stumbled on a patch of ice, Daniel's hand reached out, but Marcus's eyes flickered with impatience, as though her presence was a burden. Clara brushed it off: fatigue, altitude, nerves. Yet the mountain had a way of amplifying truths, stripping away the masks people wore in the comfort of civilization. At camp that night, Clara sat by the fire, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Daniel and Marcus spoke in hushed tones, their laughter carrying a private cadence that excluded her. She tried to join, but their conversation shifted, evasive, as though guarding a secret. Clara remembered reading about a case in the Alps where a climber had been left behind by her partner, who later claimed it was a matter of survival. The woman had endured days alone before rescue, her trust shattered not only by abandonment but by the discovery that her partner had been entangled in betrayal. Clara had dismissed the story as cruel coincidence, but now, watching Daniel and Marcus exchange glances, she felt the chill of recognition. The next day, the climb grew harsher. Snowstorms swept across ridges, visibility dropped, and exhaustion gnawed at their muscles. Clara struggled, her body heavier than usual, though she had not yet admitted to herself, or to them, that she was carrying life within her. Daniel's patience thinned. He urged her to move faster, his voice sharp, while Marcus muttered about wasted time. Clara bit back tears, forcing herself to match their pace. She told herself that marriage was about endurance, that friendship was about loyalty, and that the mountain was simply testing them. But deep down, she sensed that the test was not of physical strength but of trust. That evening, as they huddled in a makeshift shelter, Clara overheard fragments of conversation. Daniel's voice, low and urgent: "We can't keep slowing down." Marcus's reply, colder: "She'll manage, or she won't." Clara's heart pounded. The words echoed the chilling accounts she had read online, where climbers justified abandonment as necessity. Alpine divorce, they called it, a brutal severing of ties in the face of survival. But Clara was not just another climber, she was Daniel's wife. Surely, loyalty meant more than speed, more than summits. The mountain loomed larger with each step, its silence pressing against Clara's thoughts. She remembered one particular case from the Himalayas, where a husband had left his wife behind during a storm, claiming he had no choice. She had survived, miraculously, but the marriage had not. The betrayal had been too deep, the trust irreparable. Clara wondered if those stories were warnings, if the mountain itself conspired to reveal the hidden fractures in human bonds. On the third day, the tension crystallized. Clara lagged, her breath shallow, her legs trembling. Daniel and Marcus moved ahead, their figures shrinking against the white expanse. Clara called out, her voice swallowed by the wind. They paused, exchanged a look, and then continued, leaving her behind. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was the beginning of the end. Clara felt the weight of abandonment settle on her shoulders, heavier than any pack. The mountain had claimed its truth, she was alone. Yet even in that moment, Clara's resolve hardened. She thought of the women in those Alpine divorce cases, of their endurance, of their refusal to surrender. She would not be a victim of betrayal, not yet. She adjusted her pack, steadied her breath, and pressed on, each step a defiance against the cold and against the quiet treachery of those she had trusted most. The night fell, and Clara lay awake, listening to the wind tear through the peaks. Daniel and Marcus slept nearby, their bodies close, their warmth shared. Clara turned away, her heart aching with suspicion. The mountain had stripped away illusions, leaving only raw truth. She was beginning to see the outlines of betrayal, though its full shape had not yet revealed itself. For now, she was still tethered to them, still part of the trio. But deep inside, she knew the rope was fraying, and soon, it would snap. Chapter 2. The mountain had turned against them. What had begun as crisp air and glittering snow was now a relentless storm, a white wall that erased the horizon and pressed down on every breath. Daniel trudged forward, each step a negotiation with exhaustion. His muscles burned, his lungs clawed for oxygen, and his mind narrowed to a single thought, survival. Clara was slowing them down. He hated himself for thinking it, but the truth gnawed at him with every faltering step she took. Her boots dragged, her breath came in ragged gasps, and her eyes carried the dull glaze of someone fighting more than just altitude. Daniel had tried to encourage her, tried to mask his frustration with words of comfort, but the mountain stripped away patience. Every minute lost to her weakness was another minute closer to disaster. He remembered reading about grim accounts of climbers abandoning partners when survival demanded it. At the time, he had dismissed them as cowardice, betrayal dressed up as necessity. But now, with the storm clawing at his face and the summit still far above, those stories seemed less like cruelty and more like inevitability. The mountain did not care about vows or friendship, it demanded sacrifice. Marcus walked beside him, silent but steady. Daniel felt the weight of Marcus's presence, the unspoken agreement between them. They had shared glances, brief exchanges of words, both circling the same thought: Clara was a liability. Daniel's chest tightened with guilt. She was his wife. He had promised to protect her, to stand by her. Yet here, in the frozen wilderness, promises felt like luxuries they could not afford. The storm worsened. Snow lashed against their faces, visibility shrank to a few feet, and the cold seeped into their bones. Clara stumbled again, falling to her knees. Daniel rushed back, pulling her up, but her weight dragged him down. He felt Marcus's hand on his shoulder, steadying him, urging him forward. Clara's eyes met his, wide with fear, pleading. For a moment, Daniel saw not weakness but the woman he had loved, the partner who had shared his dreams. But then the wind howled, and the mountain reminded him of its indifference. "We can't stop," Marcus shouted over the storm. "If we stay here, we die." Daniel nodded, though his heart rebelled. He tried to convince himself that Clara would manage, that she would find strength once they pressed on. He told himself that leaving her behind was not abandonment but necessity. They called it a brutal severing in the face of survival. He clung to that rationalization, even as guilt gnawed at him. They moved ahead, their figures swallowed by the storm. Daniel forced himself not to look back, not to see Clara struggling in the snow. Each step forward was a betrayal, yet also a lifeline. He told himself that he would return, that once they reached safety, they would send help. But deep down, he knew the truth: the mountain had claimed its price, and he had chosen survival over love. The silence between him and Marcus grew heavier. They did not speak of what they had done, did not name it. But Daniel felt the fracture widening inside him, a crack that no summit could mend. He had left his wife behind, rationalized it as survival, but the word that echoed in his mind was betrayal. Marcus had always prided himself on his pragmatism. Where Daniel carried sentiment, Marcus carried logic. The mountain, he believed, was no place for hesitation or weakness. It demanded clarity, demanded choices stripped of emotion. And Clara, though he respected her courage, was slowing them down. He had seen it from the start, her cautious steps, her reliance on Daniel's support, her exhaustion that grew with each passing hour. Marcus had tried to mask his frustration, but the storm stripped away pretense. Every stumble, every pause, was another nail in their coffin. He had read the same accounts Daniel had, Alpine divorce cases where climbers abandoned partners to save themselves. He had never judged those decisions. To Marcus, survival was not cruelty, it was mathematics. One life weighed against two. When Clara fell to her knees, Marcus felt the decision crystallize. He saw Daniel hesitate, torn between love and survival. Marcus stepped in, steadying him, urging him forward. "If we stop, we die," he shouted, his voice carrying the cold certainty of truth. He knew Daniel would hear the logic, even if his heart resisted. As they pressed on, Marcus felt a strange detachment. He did not look back, did not allow himself to see Clara's struggle. To look would be to falter, to invite doubt. He told himself that she was strong enough to endure, that she would find a way. But deep down, he knew the odds. The mountain was merciless, and Clara was already at its edge. Marcus rationalized the choice as necessity. He reminded himself of the countless expeditions where climbers had been forced to leave behind partners, where survival demanded sacrifice. He told himself that history would not judge them harshly, that the mountain itself absolved them. Yet even as he clung to logic, a shadow of guilt lingered. Daniel's silence weighed on him. Marcus knew his friend was torn, knew that love had not surrendered easily. But Marcus also knew that survival had its own gravity, pulling them forward, away from Clara. He did not speak of betrayal, did not name the fracture. To name it would be to admit it. The storm raged, and Marcus focused on each step, each breath. He told himself that once they reached safety, they would send help, that Clara's endurance would carry her until then. But the truth gnawed at him, they had left her behind, abandoned her to the mountain's mercy. Marcus had always believed that survival justified all choices. Yet as the storm swallowed them, he felt the weight of silence pressing against his chest. He had chosen logic over loyalty, survival over compassion. Chapter 3. The silence was the first thing she noticed. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of absence, the hollow space where voices should have been. Clara turned, expecting to see Daniel's figure, Marcus's steady stride, the rope that had tethered them together. But there was nothing. Only the endless white, the storm's howl, and the crushing realization, she had been abandoned. Her knees buckled, sinking into the snow. For a moment, she could not breathe. The mountain pressed down on her chest, heavier than any pack. Betrayal was not a sudden wound but a slow freezing, creeping into her veins until she could barely move. She wanted to scream, but the wind swallowed her voice. She wanted to run after them, but her legs refused. They were gone. Her husband and his friend had left her to die. Clara's mind spiraled. She was the cautionary tale, the nameless woman left behind in the snow. The thought clawed at her, threatening to unravel her sanity. But survival instincts surged, primal and unyielding. She forced herself to stand, to breathe, to think. She inventoried her pack, half a bag of dried fruit, a flask of water, a small stove, a blanket. Not enough for weeks, but enough for days if rationed carefully. She tightened the straps, adjusted her gloves, and began to move. One step, then another. The mountain would not claim her easily. She found shelter in a hollow beneath a ridge, where the wind's fury softened. There, she scraped together snow to build a crude wall, shielding herself from the storm. Her hands trembled, her body ached, but she worked with the desperation of someone who knew that stopping meant death. When the wall stood, she crawled inside, wrapping herself in the blanket, clutching the flask like a talisman. The night was long. Hunger gnawed at her, thirst burned her throat, and fear whispered in her ear. She thought of Daniel, his laughter, his promises, his touch. She thought of Marcus's, his steady presence, his cold logic. She thought of the glances they had shared, the hushed tones that excluded her. Betrayal was no longer suspicion, it was fact. They had chosen each other over her. And she, carrying life within her, had been discarded like excess weight. Tears froze on her cheeks. She whispered to her unborn child, a fragile voice in the storm. "We will survive," she said, though she did not believe it. "We will not let them win." The words became a mantra, a lifeline. She repeated them until exhaustion claimed her, until sleep dragged her into dreams of warmth and safety that dissolved with the dawn. Days blurred into nights. Clara rationed her food, measuring each bite as though it were gold. She melted snow for water, built fires from scraps, and patched her shelter with whatever she could find. Her body weakened, but her mind sharpened. Survival was no longer a choice, it was defiance. Every breath was a refusal to die, a refusal to let betrayal define her end. Yet the mental strain was relentless. She heard voices in the wind, saw shadows in the snow. Sometimes she imagined Daniel calling her name, Marcus reaching out a hand. She would stumble into the storm, only to find emptiness. Other times, she saw herself in the stories she had read, women abandoned, men rationalizing cruelty as necessity. She was both victim and survivor, both cautionary tale and legend. The duality tore at her, threatening to fracture her mind. One evening, as the fire sputtered, Clara collapsed into sobs. The weight of betrayal crushed her, heavier than the mountain itself. She screamed into the silence, a raw sound that echoed against the peaks. "Why?" she cried. "Why did you leave me?" The mountain offered no answer. Only the wind, cold and indifferent, carried her voice away. But even in despair, determination flickered. Clara remembered the women in those Alpine divorce cases, remembered their endurance, their refusal to surrender. She clung to their stories like lifelines, drawing strength from their survival. If they could endure, so could she. If they could defy betrayal, so could she. She began to mark time, carving lines into a piece of wood she had found. Each line was a day survived, a testament to resilience. The marks grew, forming a record of defiance. She was not just surviving, she was enduring. She was proving that abandonment was not the end, that betrayal could be met with strength. Her body weakened, her mind frayed, but her spirit hardened. She learned to navigate the terrain, to read the mountain signs, to find shelter in its crevices. She became part of the wilderness, a figure carved from snow and determination. The mountain had tried to claim her, but she refused. She would not be erased. And yet, beneath the strength, the cracks remained. Clara's mental breakdown was not a collapse but a slow erosion. She spoke to shadows, argued with ghosts, laughed at the wind. She imagined conversations with Daniel, with Marcus, with her unborn child. Sometimes she believed she was not alone, that they were still with her. Other times, she knew the truth, and the knowledge cut deeper than any blade. Still, she endured. Each day was a battle, each night a victory. She was alone in the white silence, abandoned and betrayed, but she was alive. And in that survival, there was power. Clara was no longer just a victim of Alpine divorce, she was its defiance, its counterpoint, its living proof that betrayal could be met with resilience. The mountain had stripped away everything, love, trust, companionship, but it had not stripped away her will. Clara stood in the snow, her body frail, her mind fractured, but her spirit unbroken. She whispered to her child, to herself, to the silence, "We will survive." And the mountain, indifferent and eternal, bore witness to her defiance. Chapter 4. The mountain did not relent. Days bled into weeks, and weeks into months, each one marked by Clara's stubborn refusal to surrender. Alone in the white silence, she became both hunter and hunted, pursuing scraps of life while fending off despair that stalked her like a shadow. Her survival began with discipline. She rationed food with the precision of a soldier, measuring each bite of dried fruit as though it were currency. Hunger gnawed at her constantly, but she learned to silence its demands, convincing herself that endurance mattered more than comfort. Water was no less precious. She melted snow in her small stove, careful to conserve fuel, and learned to track streams hidden beneath ice. The sound of trickling water became a beacon, guiding her through the wilderness when all else failed. Shelter was her greatest challenge. The flimsy blanket and hollow ridge that had saved her in the first days were not enough for months of exposure. Clara studied the terrain, recalling survival manuals she had once skimmed, and began to carve snow caves into drifts. She discovered that compacted snow, though cold, insulated against the wind. Each cave became a temporary home, a fragile fortress against storms. She lined the walls with branches scavenged from the sparse alpine trees, layering them with scraps of cloth torn from her pack. The caves were crude, but they kept her alive. Fire was her salvation. She learned to coax flames from damp wood, to shield sparks from the wind, to feed embers with patience. The fire became more than warmth, it was companionship. She spoke to it as though it were a friend, whispering prayers into its glow. "Keep us alive," she murmured, her hands stretched toward the flickering light. The fire answered with crackles, a language she came to understand as hope. Yet survival was not only physical. Clara's mind teetered on the edge of collapse, and she knew that endurance required more than food and shelter. She began to journal, scratching words onto scraps of paper salvaged from her pack. The entries were uneven, sometimes coherent, sometimes rambling, but they anchored her. She wrote of betrayal, of hunger, of the child growing inside her. She wrote of Alpine divorce stories she had once read, now hauntingly real. Each word was a defiance, a refusal to let silence consume her. Prayer became another lifeline. Clara knelt in the snow, her breath forming clouds, and whispered to God, to her child, to herself. She prayed for strength, for forgiveness, for clarity. Sometimes the prayers were desperate, begging for rescue. Other times they were calm, a meditation on endurance. Prayer gave her rhythm, a structure to days that otherwise dissolved into monotony. Her pregnancy was both burden and motivation. The weight slowed her, the fatigue deepened, yet the life inside her became a reason to fight. She spoke to the child constantly, promising survival, promising love. "We are together," she said, pressing her hand against her belly. "We will not be broken." The child became her anchor, a reminder that betrayal had not erased her purpose. Still, mental stability was fragile. Clara's mind fractured under the strain, slipping between clarity and hallucination. She saw Daniel in the snow, Marcus in the shadows, their figures taunting her. She heard voices in the wind, whispers of abandonment, echoes of betrayal. Sometimes she laughed at them, a brittle sound that startled even herself. Other times she screamed, raw and unrestrained, until her throat burned. Yet even in breakdown, resilience emerged. Clara learned to harness her hallucinations, to turn them into fuel. When she saw Daniel's figure, she imagined confronting him, demanding answers. When she heard Marcus's voice, she argued with it, refusing to accept his logic. The hallucinations became rehearsals for survival, battles fought in her mind that strengthened her resolve. Months passed, marked by the rhythm of survival. Clara tracked the sun's arc, measured the length of shadows, carved lines into wood to mark time. Each line was a victory, a testament to endurance. She became part of the mountain, her body frail but her spirit hardened. The wilderness no longer terrified her, it became her companion, her adversary, her mirror. Her resilience was not constant. There were nights when despair overwhelmed her, when she lay curled in her snow cave, whispering that she could not go on. But each morning, she rose. Each morning, she melted snow, built fire, rationed food. Survival was not a single triumph but 1,000 small victories, repeated day after day. Chapter 5. The ridge was quiet that morning, the kind of silence that made every crunch of boots against snow sound louder than it should. The group of hikers, 3 men and 2 women, had set out early, their packs heavy with supplies, their spirits lifted by the promise of clear skies. They were seasoned trekkers, familiar with the dangers of alpine terrain, but none of them were prepared for what they would find. It was Anna, the youngest of the group, who spotted her first. At the edge of a snow cave, a figure crouched low, wrapped in tattered blankets, her hair matted, her face gaunt. For a moment, Anna thought she was seeing a ghost. The woman looked carved from the mountain itself, pale and fragile, yet undeniably alive. "Someone's here," Anna whispered, her voice trembling. The others gathered, their eyes widening as they took in the sight. Clara raised her head slowly, blinking against the sudden intrusion. Her eyes were hollow yet fierce, carrying the weight of months of solitude. The hikers froze, unsure whether to approach. Survival stories had taught them caution, sometimes desperation made people dangerous. But Clara's gaze was not threatening, it was pleading. "Help me," she rasped, her voice cracked from disuse. The group sprang into action. David, the eldest, knelt beside her, offering water. Clara drank greedily, the liquid spilling down her chin. Anna handed her a protein bar, which she devoured with trembling hands. The others began assessing her condition, frostbite on her fingers, malnutrition evident in her frame, exhaustion etched into every movement. Yet beneath the frailty, there was resilience. She had survived months alone in the wilderness, a feat that stunned even these seasoned hikers. "How long have you been here?" David asked gently. Clara shook her head, unable to measure time anymore. "Months," she whispered. "They left me." The words hung in the air, heavy and incomprehensible. The hikers exchanged glances, trying to process what she meant. Left her? By whom? Why? But the urgency of her condition demanded action before questions. They wrapped her in spare jackets, secured her to a sled, and began the long descent toward safety. The journey was grueling. Clara drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring fragments of sentences, names, accusations, prayers. The hikers listened, piecing together fragments of her ordeal. She spoke of betrayal, of abandonment, of survival against impossible odds. Each word deepened their shock. They had read about Alpine divorce cases, where climbers abandoned partners in desperation, but to see its living proof was something else entirely. When they reached the base camp, word spread quickly. Other trekkers gathered, their faces etched with disbelief. Clara became the center of hushed conversations, her survival a story that demanded retelling. By the time they reached the nearest village, journalists had already arrived, drawn by whispers of a woman who had endured months alone in the mountains. The media frenzy was immediate. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, questions shouted. "How did you survive? Who left you? What happened up there?" Clara, still weak, struggled to answer. The hikers shielded her, insisting she needed rest, but the story had already taken root. Headlines spoke of the miracle survivor, the woman abandoned in the Alps. For the hikers, the shock lingered. They had expected to find snow, silence, perhaps danger, but not a living testament to betrayal. In private, they spoke of her endurance with awe. "She built snow caves," Anna said, her voice reverent. "She melted snow for water, rationed scraps of food. She prayed, she journaled. She survived." David shook his head. "I've seen strong climbers break after days alone. She lasted months. That's not just survival, that's defiance." Yet beneath their admiration lay unease. Clara's story was not just one of endurance, it was one of abandonment. The hikers could not fathom how a husband and friend could leave her behind, how betrayal could be rationalized as necessity. They had read about such cases, but seeing the consequences in flesh and bone made the cruelty undeniable. As Clara regained strength, fragments of truth surfaced. She spoke of Daniel and Marcus, of their distance, their hushed conversations, their decision to leave her. She spoke of betrayal not only in survival but in love, of discovering their affair, of realizing that her abandonment was not just desperation but conspiracy. The hikers listened, horrified. They had rescued a woman from the mountain, but her wounds were deeper than frostbite and hunger. Betrayal had carved scars into her soul, scars that no rescue could erase. In the days that followed, investigators arrived. They interviewed Clara, pieced together her account, and began probing Daniel and Marcus's story. The hikers watched as the narrative shifted from survival miracle to criminal investigation. Clara's endurance was no longer just a testament to resilience, it was evidence in a case of betrayal and conspiracy. Chapter 6. The case file lay open on the desk, its pages heavy with contradictions. To the investigator, Clara's survival was remarkable, but the circumstances surrounding her abandonment demanded scrutiny. Outdoor cases were not unheard of, partners left behind in storms, climbers forced to choose between loyalty and survival. Yet something about Clara's ordeal felt different. The details did not align with necessity, they hinted at conspiracy. The investigator began with interviews. Clara, still recovering in the hospital, spoke in fragments. Her voice was fragile, but her words carried weight. "They left me," she said, eyes distant. "Not because they had to. Because they wanted to." She described Daniel's impatience, Marcus's cold logic, the hushed conversations that excluded her. She spoke of betrayal not only in survival but in intimacy, of glances exchanged between her husband and his friend that now seemed laden with meaning. The investigator listened, noting each detail, each hesitation. Clara's account was not the rambling of trauma, it was consistent, precise. Yet evidence was needed. Survival stories often blurred under the weight of exhaustion and grief. To prove conspiracy, facts had to be unearthed. The search began with Daniel and Marcus. Their statements were rehearsed, their words carefully chosen. They claimed the storm had forced their hand, that Clara had fallen behind, that survival demanded they press on. "We thought she would catch up," Daniel insisted. "We had no choice." Marcus echoed him, his tone colder, more detached. "It was her pace," he said. "We couldn't risk all 3 lives." But the investigator had heard such rationalizations before. Alpine divorce cases often carried the same refrain, necessity. Yet necessity left traces, timelines, decisions, evidence of desperation. In Daniel and Marcus's accounts, the traces were missing. Their story was too clean, too aligned, too rehearsed. Digital evidence provided the first crack. Phone records revealed late-night messages between Daniel and Marcus, exchanges that went beyond logistics. The language was intimate, suggestive, far removed from the camaraderie of climbing partners. Financial records showed joint purchases, trips taken together without Clara, expenses hidden under vague descriptions. The investigator pieced the fragments together, forming a picture that was undeniable. Daniel and Marcus were not just friends. They were lovers. The revelation shifted the case. Clara's abandonment was not the result of circumstance but of betrayal. The investigator imagined the climb through their eyes, Clara as burden, Clara as obstacle, Clara as the inconvenient truth that stood between them. The mountain had not forced their hand, desire had. Betrayal had been planned, rationalized, executed under the guise of survival. When the evidence was presented to Clara, the devastation was palpable. She sat in silence, her hands trembling, her eyes fixed on the floor. The investigator watched as the truth settled over her like a second storm. Survival had been brutal, but betrayal cut deeper. She had endured hunger, cold, solitude, but the knowledge that her husband and his friend had conspired against her, had chosen each other over her, was unbearable. Her pregnancy made the revelation heavier still. Clara pressed her hand against her belly, tears streaming down her face. He left us, she whispered. Not just me. Us. The investigator felt the weight of those words, the enormity of betrayal magnified by the life she carried. Daniel had not abandoned only his wife, he had abandoned his child. The investigator documented everything: Clara's testimony, the digital evidence, the inconsistencies in Daniel and Marcus's accounts. The case shifted from survival tragedy to criminal conspiracy. Charges of reckless endangerment, fraud, and abandonment loomed. The media, already captivated by Clara's survival, seized upon the betrayal. Headlines spoke not only of endurance but of scandal, of a husband and friend whose affair had led to abandonment. For the investigator, the case was more than evidence, it was a study in human frailty. The mountain had tested them, but betrayal had defined them. Clara's survival was extraordinary, but her endurance was not just against nature, it was against the cruelty of those she had trusted most. In the quiet moments of the investigation, the investigator reflected on Clara's strength. She had survived months alone, sustained by discipline and prayer, only to face a truth more brutal than the wilderness. Yet even in devastation, she carried resilience. Her testimony was clear, her resolve unbroken. Betrayal had scarred her, but it had not silenced her. The discovery was complete: Daniel and Marcus were not victims of circumstance but conspirators. Their affair was the hidden fracture that had widened into abandonment. Clara's survival was not just a miracle of endurance, it was a testament to resilience in the face of betrayal. The investigator closed the file, knowing the case was far from over. Arrests would follow, trials would unfold, but the truth had been uncovered. Clara's ordeal was no longer just a survival story, it was a story of conspiracy, betrayal, and defiance. And in that truth, the investigator saw both the cruelty of human weakness and the strength of human resilience. Chapter 7. The hospital walls felt like a cage. Clara lay in the bed, her body recovering but her mind unraveling. Every visitor, every question, every flash of a camera reminded her of betrayal. She had survived the mountain, but the truth she now carried was heavier than snow, heavier than hunger. Daniel and Marcus had not been victims of circumstance, they had been conspirators. Lovers. Betrayers. At first, Clara denied it. She told herself the investigators were mistaken, that the messages and financial records were misinterpreted. Daniel had loved her once, Marcus had been a friend. Surely abandonment had been born of desperation, not desire. She clung to denial like a rope, refusing to let go. But denial frayed quickly. The evidence was undeniable, the whispers too loud. Every glance between Daniel and Marcus that she had once dismissed now replayed in her mind with cruel clarity. Acceptance came slowly, like frost creeping across glass. Clara began to see the truth not as a possibility but as fact. They had chosen each other. They had left her behind, not because the mountain demanded it, but because she was inconvenient. Her pregnancy had been a burden, her presence an obstacle. Betrayal was not an accident, it was deliberate. Acceptance was not relief, it was agony. It cut deeper than the wilderness ordeal, deeper than hunger or cold. It was a wound that no fire could warm, no shelter could protect. The weight of her pregnancy made the revelation unbearable. Clara pressed her hand against her belly, feeling the faint stirrings of life. The child was innocent, yet already scarred by betrayal. Daniel had abandoned not only his wife but his unborn child. The thought hollowed her, filled her with rage and sorrow. She whispered to the child, promising survival, promising love, even as her own heart fractured. "We will not be broken," she said, though her voice trembled. The media frenzy suffocated her. Reporters camped outside the hospital, headlines screamed her name, strangers speculated about her ordeal. Some called her a miracle, others questioned her story. Was she complicit? Had she exaggerated? The speculation cut deep, turning her survival into spectacle. Clara felt stripped of privacy, her pain dissected for entertainment. She longed for silence, for anonymity, for shadows where she could breathe. One night, overwhelmed, Clara slipped away. She left the hospital quietly, moving through corridors like a ghost. She avoided authorities, friends, family. She retreated into anonymity, disappearing into the city's underbelly. She found refuge in cheap motels, in shelters, in places where no one asked questions. She became invisible, a shadow moving through streets, carrying her child and her grief. Her absence fueled speculation. The media spun theories. Had she fled out of guilt? Was she complicit in Daniel and Marcus's scheme? Was she unstable, broken by trauma? Investigators probed deeper, their focus shifting to Daniel and Marcus, but Clara's disappearance added complexity. Without her presence, the narrative fractured, leaving room for doubt. In solitude, Clara wrestled with her emotions. Denial had crumbled, acceptance had scarred, but justice remained. She began to write again, journaling in scraps of paper, documenting her ordeal. She wrote of betrayal, of survival, of the child she carried. She wrote not for herself but for justice, for truth. Each word was a demand, a refusal to let betrayal go unpunished. Her mind oscillated between despair and determination. Some nights, she wept, convinced she could not endure. Other nights, she burned with rage, vowing to see Daniel and Marcus held accountable. Her disappearance was not surrender, it was preparation. She needed space, silence, shadows to gather strength. She needed to reclaim her voice, not as victim but as witness. Investigators continued their work, piecing together evidence, probing Daniel and Marcus's lies. Clara watched from the shadows, following reports, listening to whispers. She saw the cracks widening, the truth emerging. Her absence became strategic, her silence a weapon. She would return, not broken, but ready to demand justice. Clara's journey through denial, acceptance, and demand for justice was not linear. It was a spiral, a cycle of pain and resilience. She had survived the mountain, survived betrayal, survived speculation. Now she prepared to survive justice itself. Her child was her anchor, her reason, her strength. She whispered to the life inside her a promise. "We will see justice," she said. "We will not be erased." Chapter 8. The investigation began with a paradox. On one hand, Clara's survival was hailed as miraculous, a testament to human endurance against the merciless wilderness. On the other, her account of abandonment raised troubling questions. Authorities could not dismiss her words as trauma-induced confusion, they were too consistent, too precise. And so, what had begun as a survival story slowly transformed into a criminal inquiry. The lead investigators were seasoned in Alpine tragedies. They had studied precedents, cases where climbers had left partners behind, rationalizing abandonment as necessity. The term Alpine divorce was familiar to them, a grim shorthand for the severing of bonds in the face of survival. Yet Clara's ordeal did not fit neatly into those precedents. In most cases, abandonment was sudden, born of storms or exhaustion. Clara's abandonment carried the weight of deliberation, of betrayal that stretched beyond the mountain. The first step was to examine Daniel and Marcus's accounts. Both men insisted that the storm had forced their hand. They claimed Clara had lagged behind, that they had pressed forward to save themselves, believing she would catch up. Their words echoed the familiar refrain of necessity. But investigators noted the rehearsed cadence, the alignment of details too perfect to be natural. Survival stories were rarely so clean. Witness testimonies added cracks. Other climbers recalled seeing Daniel and Marcus together before the expedition, their closeness more intimate than friendship. A shopkeeper remembered them purchasing supplies in pairs, whispering in tones that excluded Clara. Guides spoke of their impatience with her pace, their frustration at her presence. Each testimony was a fragment, but together they formed a mosaic of suspicion. Digital traces deepened the inquiry. Phone records revealed late-night messages between Daniel and Marcus, exchanges laced with intimacy. Financial records showed joint purchases, trips taken together without Clara, expenses hidden under vague descriptions. Investigators pieced the fragments together, uncovering a relationship that had been concealed beneath the guise of friendship. The affair was undeniable. The revelation shifted the case. Clara's abandonment was not the result of circumstance but of conspiracy. Daniel and Marcus had not been forced to leave her, they had chosen to. The mountain had not demanded sacrifice, desire had. Betrayal was not incidental, it was deliberate. Survival psychology became another lens. Experts explained that trauma often sharpened memory rather than distorting it. Clara's account of hushed conversations, lingering glances, and exclusion was consistent with patterns of betrayal. Her endurance, her ability to ration food, build shelters, and journal, was not the mark of delusion but of resilience. Her testimony carried credibility, strengthened by her survival strategies. Investigators compared her ordeal to Alpine divorce precedents. In most cases, abandonment was justified by immediate danger, storms, avalanches, exhaustion. Clara's case lacked those triggers. The storm had been real, but not insurmountable. Her pace had slowed, but not fatally. The decision to leave her was not necessity, it was choice. The precedent could not shield Daniel and Marcus from accountability. As evidence mounted, inconsistencies in their accounts became glaring. Timelines did not align. Their descriptions of the storm contradicted weather reports. Their claim that Clara had fallen behind was undermined by her testimony of overhearing their conversation before they left her. Their insistence that they believed she would catch up was contradicted by their failure to report her missing immediately. Each inconsistency was a fracture, widening into proof of conspiracy. The case shifted irrevocably. What had begun as a survival tragedy was now a criminal investigation. Charges of reckless endangerment, fraud, and conspiracy loomed. The media, already captivated by Clara's survival, seized upon the betrayal. Headlines spoke not only of endurance but of scandal, of a husband and friend whose affair had led to abandonment. For investigators, the case was more than evidence, it was a study in human frailty. The mountain had tested them, but betrayal had defined them. Clara's survival was extraordinary, but her endurance was not just against nature, it was against the cruelty of those she had trusted most. In the quiet of the investigation room, the lead investigator reflected on Clara's strength. She had survived months alone, sustained by discipline and prayer, only to face a truth more brutal than the wilderness. Yet even in devastation, she carried resilience. Her testimony was clear, her resolve unbroken. Betrayal had scarred her, but it had not silenced her. Chapter 9. The newsroom buzzed with urgency. Phones rang, editors shouted across desks, and screens flickered with breaking headlines. The arrest of Daniel and Marcus was not just another story, it was the kind of scandal that demanded front-page coverage, the kind that blurred the line between survival tragedy and criminal conspiracy. Reporters scrambled to craft the narrative. Clara's ordeal had already captivated audiences worldwide, but the revelation of deliberate abandonment, and the affair between her husband and his friend, turned the story into something larger. It was no longer about endurance in the wilderness, it was about betrayal, conspiracy, and justice. Breaking news, one anchor announced live, her voice steady but charged with emotion. Authorities have arrested Daniel Harper and Marcus Red on charges of reckless endangerment, fraud, and conspiracy. The arrests come after months of investigation into the ordeal of Clara Harper, who survived alone in the Alpine wilderness after being abandoned during an expedition. The words rippled across networks, echoed in headlines, splashed across social media feeds. Reckless endangerment. Fraud. Conspiracy. The charges carried weight, transforming Daniel and Marcus from climbers into criminals, from survivors into suspects. Reporters narrated the arrests with vivid detail. Police moved in early this morning, one correspondent explained, standing outside the courthouse. Both men were taken into custody without incident. Their faces were pale, their silence deafening. The crowd gathered outside shouted accusations, some demanding justice, others stunned by the betrayal that has now been confirmed. The media frenzy erupted. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward, questions shouted. Did you abandon her deliberately? Were you lovers? Do you regret what you did? Daniel kept his head down, Marcus stared ahead, both refusing to answer. Their silence became its own headline, the men who wouldn't speak. Clara's name dominated coverage. Reporters framed her as the central figure, the survivor whose truth dismantled lies. She endured months alone in the wilderness, one article read, but her greatest endurance was against betrayal. Clara Harper's testimony, her resilience, and her courage have transformed this case from tragedy to scandal, from silence to justice. Narrations carried a tone of awe and outrage. This is one of the most shocking Alpine divorce cases ever recorded, a documentary-style segment declared. Not only was Clara abandoned in the mountains, but she was betrayed by the two people she trusted most. Her survival is extraordinary, but her strength in exposing the truth is even more remarkable. Reporters dissected the evidence, weaving it into the narrative. Digital records revealed late-night messages between Daniel and Marcus, one investigative journalist explained. Financial documents showed hidden expenses, trips taken together. Witnesses described their closeness, their impatience with Clara. The evidence paints a picture not of necessity, but of conspiracy. The public consumed every detail. Talk shows debated the psychology of betrayal, survival experts analyzed Clara's endurance, commentators reflected on the cultural implications of Alpine divorce. This case forces us to confront the darkest corners of human relationships, one panelist argued. It shows how survival can be twisted into justification, how betrayal can masquerade as necessity. Clara's absence during the arrests fueled speculation. Reporters noted her disappearance, her retreat into shadows, her refusal to face the media frenzy. She has chosen silence, one anchor said, but her silence speaks volumes. It is not surrender, it is resilience. Clara Harper has already told her story, and now the evidence speaks for itself. Narrations shifted the narrative arc. Clara was no longer framed as the abandoned wife, the victim left to die. She was the survivor, the defiant figure whose endurance had exposed betrayal. Her truth dismantled lies, one headline proclaimed. Her survival became justice. Reporters highlighted the symbolic weight of her pregnancy. She carried life within her even as she carried betrayal, one feature article wrote. Her child became her anchor, her reason to endure. The revelation that Daniel abandoned not only his wife but his unborn child has deepened the outrage, magnifying the cruelty of his actions. The arrests became spectacle, but beneath the frenzy lay a deeper narrative. Clara's ordeal was not just about survival in the wilderness, it was about survival in the face of betrayal, survival against the erosion of trust. Reporters framed her as both victim and victor, scarred but unbroken. Clara Harper's story will be remembered, one documentary narrator intoned. Not only as a tale of endurance, but as a testament to resilience. She survived the mountain, she survived betrayal, and now she has survived the truth. Her voice has transformed tragedy into justice, silence into revelation. Chapter 10. Daniel sat in the courtroom, the air heavy with anticipation. The cameras clicked, the reporters whispered, and the judge's gavel echoed like a heartbeat. He had thought the mountain would bury her, that the snow would silence her forever. He had convinced himself that Clara's frailty would not withstand the wilderness, that her disappearance would erase the inconvenient truth of his betrayal. But she had returned. Stronger. Transformed. When Clara entered, the room shifted. She was no longer the gaunt figure he had left behind in the storm. Her posture was upright, her eyes steady, her presence commanding. She carried herself not as victim but as survivor, her child a silent testament to endurance. Daniel's chest tightened. He had wanted her gone, erased, forgotten. Instead, she had become the very force that dismantled his lies. Her testimony was precise, unwavering. She spoke of the storm, of the hushed conversations, of the moment he and Marcus had left her behind. She described the snow caves she built, the fires she coaxed, the prayers she whispered. She spoke of betrayal, of discovering their affair, of realizing that abandonment was not necessity but conspiracy. Each word was a blade, cutting through the fabric of his defense. Daniel felt regret, but not for the betrayal itself. His regret was sharper, darker, regret that she had survived. If she had died, the mountain would have carried the blame. He and Marcus could have mourned publicly, their affair hidden beneath grief. But Clara's survival had exposed everything. Her endurance had turned their rationalizations into lies, their secrecy into scandal. He watched her speak, her voice steady, her eyes unyielding. She was no longer the woman he had dismissed as weak. She was formidable, her strength forged in solitude. Daniel realized that the mountain had not broken her, it had remade her. And in that remaking, she had become his undoing. The media framed her as hero, survivor, defiant figure. Daniel was framed as conspirator, betrayer, criminal. He felt the weight of public outrage, the whispers of shame. He had thought betrayal would free him, but it had shackled him instead. Clara's survival was not just endurance, it was justice. As the gavel struck, Daniel lowered his head. His regret consumed him. He had wanted her gone, erased by snow and silence. Instead, she had returned, stronger than ever, sealing his fate with truth. Marcus sat beside Daniel, his jaw clenched, his mind spiraling. He had always prided himself on logic, on pragmatism. The mountain had been a calculation, Clara was slowing them down, survival demanded sacrifice. He had convinced himself that leaving her was necessity, that betrayal was justified. But now, watching her stand in the courtroom, he realized the flaw in his logic. Clara had survived. And survival had transformed her into their accuser. Her presence was unbearable. She spoke with clarity, her words sharp, her gaze piercing. She described their impatience, their whispers, their decision to leave her. She spoke of betrayal not only in survival but in love, of discovering their affair, of realizing that abandonment was deliberate. Marcus felt each word as a blow, dismantling the rationalizations he had built. He regretted her survival, not because he wished her harm, but because her endurance had destroyed the narrative he had crafted. If she had died, the story would have been simple, a tragedy, a storm, a loss. He and Daniel could have mourned, their affair hidden beneath grief. But Clara's survival had turned tragedy into conspiracy, necessity into betrayal. Marcus watched her, his mind unraveling. She was no longer the burden he had dismissed. She was formidable, her strength undeniable. The mountain had not claimed her, it had remade her. And in that remaking, she had become the force that exposed him. The media frenzy amplified her voice, painting her as hero, survivor, defiant figure. Marcus was painted as conspirator, betrayer, criminal. He felt the weight of public outrage, the whispers of shame. His logic had failed him. Betrayal had not freed him, it had condemned him. As Clara's testimony sealed the case, Marcus felt regret deepen. He regretted underestimating her, regretted believing the mountain would silence her. He regretted the cold logic that had led him to betrayal. But most of all, he regretted her survival, not because he wished her dead, but because her endurance had dismantled his lies, exposed his weakness, and sealed his fate. The gavel struck, and Marcus closed his eyes. Clara had returned, stronger and transformed. Her testimony had sealed the case, her survival had become justice. His regret was heavy, his logic shattered. He had wanted the mountain to erase her, but instead, it had remade her into the very force that destroyed him. Subscribe for more stories.